Today's lecture, of course, I'll be getting into. This lecture is going to primarily focus on two things. Of course, one is I'll kind of talk about the Greco-Persian Wars. We'll get to that, and of course, we'll talk about the aftermath of it because we haven't really finished it. We kind of like halfway through it almost at this point because we've only talked about the first invasion. We'll get to the second major invasion, of course, of Xerxes that comes in after that, and then I'll also talk about examples of classical Greek culture. Like the Olympics. Anyway, of course, I'll be continuing, like I said, talking about the Greco-Persian Wars, which we had already kind of started on that topic already, kind of talking about the first invasion by King Darius the Great, who, of course, sent forces that attacked or tried to attack Athens, I guess, at that point in the year 490 BC. And that led to the so-called Battle of Marathon, as you know, where the Greeks humiliated the Persians in that battle. However, we had another invasion, of course, that would follow next, of course, which I'll talk a lot about today, which occurs around the year 480, as you see right here. And of course, Xerxes attempts this second invasion. Xerxes the Great, I think I talked about before, was the son of King Darius the Great, and they believe his force. So that Herodotus is, like I talked about before, was one of the main sources on. Herodotus claimed that Xerxes' forces had a huge army that was like a 1,000,000-man army. They think that's kind of exaggerated, but they do think that he had at least 250,000 troops. I think that's probably the current number I know today that most historians think it was in size. This invasion went more by land. Of course, was more involved in going up through northern Greece. By the way, Aisha's also joined us in StreamYard also as well. So hope you're having a good afternoon out there. But so he invades up through northern Greece at that point. That leads, like I told you before, it leads to very famous battles later, like the Battle of Thermopylae, the Battle of Salamis, both in the year 480. And then later there's another battle called the Battle of Plataea that occurs in 479. So the second invasion, main invasion, is mostly between 480 to about 479 BC. The Greeks at that point formed an alliance with the other city-states to bring up forces. And if you go to this map here that I've got, you can kind of see the path that Xerxes takes with his naval force. If you look at this map here, you can see that Xerxes crossed the Hellespont, which is right here between like northwestern Turkey, here at Thrace, which is part of east part of Greece. Now it's part of Turkey today, where Constantinople is up in here somewhere. But they would basically cross there, and then using his navy, he would back his forces up as they basically hugged the coast in his invasion through northern Greece. One of the things that the Greeks decided to do was they brought forces to the north, like around Thermopylae, which was right here. Also, another place they brought forces to, like land forces right here. They also brought forces like naval forces up to where Artemisium is, which is a little city-state that's on the island of Euboea. They were going to try to block the Persian navy from coming through here. So the idea was to try to block, the Persian force to the north, and then maybe they could basically be able to get forces, up there like reinforcements so they could stop, Xerxes at that point. And what ends up happening, if you know about it, leads to a very famous battle that's later called the Battle of Thermopylae, which takes place in the year 480, but in August 480 BC is when, of course, it would occur. Now I'm going to get to that in a second. Of course, here's, a picture of Xerxes right here. Xerxes, of course, probably the third major king of Persia. His forces will eventually try to overwhelm, of course, the Greeks. And Persian forces were led by a famous king of Sparta named King Leonidas. He was brought there with a force of about, I think the size of the actual force of the Greeks was somewhere between 6,000 to 7,000 troops. And it just wasn't Spartans. And then they talk about the 300 Spartans that are at Thermopylae and all that. But it did include other city-states involved. The city-state of Thebes put up forces, which is nearby, and also the city-state of Thespia was also involved. And Thermopylae was an important area. That area, if you know about Thermopylae, the name means in Greek hot gates because there's some natural hot springs that are there where people would bathe there. But it was also a very important pass and road system that ran through Boeotia. Like, so if you're going to attack from northern Greece into Boeotia and then attack Attica, where Athens is, you had to go down through that, through that pass right there. I've got a picture of the battlefield. The one thing about Thermopylae, of course, pass was that in ancient times, it was a very narrow pass. Of course, today it's not. It's actually kind of from erosion. It's more wider than what it looks like today. But in ancient times, it was a very narrow pass. And so the Greeks used that to their advantage because they were, badly outnumbered in the battle. So at Thermopylae, you basically had two sides pitted against each other. You had the Persian army, which had about maybe 250,000 personally led by Xerxes. And in the Greek army, they, like I said, 6,000, 7,000, I think it seems to be the amount that they think they had at that point. And so Thermopylae ends up being this three-day battle for control of the pass. Herodotus claims that they lost something like 20,000 men. The Persians trying to break through the pass. They had, even had some elite forces. You may have heard of the Immortals, which were some of the crack troops of Xerxes that tried to break through, but they couldn't break through because of the narrow pass and, of course, the Greek phalanx being so deadly that just the dead bodies all piled up at that point. Here's, of course, a famous statue of Leonidas, who, of course, is at that battle. And in the beginning of the battle, which is very famous, if you know about this, the Persians were kind of miffed that, the Greeks didn't want to put down their arms. And of course, if you know about it, Leonidas said the famous quote, "Come and get them." Anyway, looks like Fernando's also joining us. So we're having a good afternoon. But what happened was there was this Greek trader named Ephialtes who switched over from the Greek to the Persian side. And he told the Persians about a shortcut, it was kind of like a goat path that went around the mountains nearby where you could go around the pass. And from there, Leonidas was able to outflank Leonidas' forces and encircle him. And of course, the Thermopylae Pass. The name Ephialtes, by the way, in Greek today means actually nightmare because it became a nightmare, of course, for the Greeks at that battle. Because basically, what's going to happen is it's going to lead to his forces being surrounded, and he has to evacuate some of them, Leonidas, or they're going to get all annihilated. And so he kind of remained with a kind of a rear guard. With mostly some of the Spartans and other Greeks, and they fought to the last man, of course, in the battle. And that's one of the famous things about the Battle of Thermopylae. It's kind of like the Greeks' version of Custer's Last Stand. They fight to the last man, and even Leonidas is killed in the battle, if you know about that as well. But Thermopylae is very important. They believe it demoralized Xerxes' forces. They think it was kind of like this Pyrrhic victory that kind of helped the Greeks later, because you can see there it allowed them to bring up forces later to fight in the war. Also allowed them to evacuate civilians that were like in Boeotia, Attica, etc. And that would basically, help also, in this battle against the, Persian forces that are coming down the pass at that point. So So yeah, the Greeks basically evacuate their forces, and they mostly evacuate them to the island of Salamis because that's going to lead into another pivotal battle, of course, in the second invasion, which of course is the Battle of Salamis, which took place in the Saronic Gulf, close to where Athens is today. That's of course another thing I kind of need to talk about as well, because that's a very pivotal battle, which you can kind of see in this map right here. Takes place kind of to the west of Athens. Saronic Gulf is like you can see right here at the bottom. So Salamis is right here, a famous island that's off the coast of Greece. That would be a very pivotal location of where the two naval powers would battle it out. You'd have, of course, the famous Persian Navy, which, by the way, they say was superior to the Greek navies at that point at the time. But Salamis took place in September of that year, is considered one of the major turning points of the Persian Wars, not Thermopylae. I know they talk about Thermopylae all the time, and I suppose that battle that changed the world and all that stuff, but they think Salamis was really the battle that probably changed things more than anything. The Greeks were persuaded by this Athenian general named Themistocles, by the way, to battle against the Persians in that Gulf that we're talking about. Themistocles, I think later was a famous politician in Athens, but he was the main general that led the Greek forces, which I think the majority of the Greek fleet, about 60%, almost two-thirds of it was Athenian. The rest were other city-states that put up also ships with their fleets. And his smaller force, which may have been like somewhere between 300-400 ships, was able to beat a much larger Persian navy, which may have been close to 1,200 ships in their naval force in the battle. They think that part of why the Greeks won the battle was because Salamis was such a narrow pass, like a narrow strait, kind of like Thermopylae Pass is. But also, you have to understand that the Greek warships at the time were pretty superior. The Greeks had the so-called trireme, you may have heard of, which were famous galley warships that were kind of well known, that went back to Phoenician times. Greeks used them, and Romans had variations of them also as well. And the trireme was a famous warship that used 3 banks of oars. In fact, the word trireme means in Greek 3-rower, basically. And they're famous for having these rams on the front, which you can see. They would ram basically ships like below the water level, below the water level, and basically sink them. And so those are the kind of ships that were dominant in the Greek world. And Athens, after the war, became one of the major naval powers, of course, in the Aegean, like we talked about. So, the war would come to an end later. Yeah, they do have another battle, which I think if you study about what happens later, they do have the Battle of Plataea, I think, that happens, which I think that battle is located, you can see it right here, but Xerxes at that point begins to give up the invasion, but he leaves actually some of his forces under this general named Meridaunus, to keep trying to maybe attack toward the Peloponnese. But the Greeks were able to bring up reinforcements. And at the Battle of Plataea in 479, the Greeks wiped out the rest of the Persian navy, the Persian armies at that point that were there. Their navies kind of forced to evacuate everybody at that point. So Persian wars keep going. I mean, they're fighting down to about 450 BC. I think they were about 50 years in length, the actual wars. But the Greeks would keep trying to push, the Persians out of the Aegean basin, especially out of like Western Turkey and all that. And then Alexander the Great, later will try to he'll do that too. Also, he'll be more successful in pushing them out. But this is kind of a conflict that kind of goes on for really into the next century, into the 4th century. All right, I'll kind of talk about, of course, a few other things I want to get into today. I want to talk about also the aftermath, I guess, of what happens after the wars. They do have this period later that they call in history called the Age of Pericles that comes along. Some people call it the so-called Golden Age of Athens. It's been another nickname they refer to it as overall. And what happened after the war was that there was this Athenian politician named Pericles who came to power. And before that happened, there was this alliance that formed that was called the Delian League. In 478 BC, the Greeks formed this because there was this fear that the Persians were going to come back. They were going to invade, Greece another time. They also were hoping to push the Persians out of the Aegean Islands, maybe out of Western Turkey as well. And so they wanted to continue this war against the Persians that they had started. And so the Delian League had something like 200-300 city-states that were in it. And why they call it Delian League? Well, there was an actual, you study about it, there was an island in the Cyclades, like southern Aegean, that was called Delos. And that was where their main headquarters was, where the alliance would have its, annual meetings during the year. And they kept all the money, for the actual alliance, like the treasury, in the actual Temple of Apollo. It's like one of the famous temples, I think that's in Greece. I think that one in Delphi, the two big temples of Apollo they had in the Greek world. And back in those days, temples were like banks. You could put money in a temple, if you put money somewhere, whatever. And what happened, though, was Pericles, who we'll get to later, was an Athenian statesman who had a lot of power in Athens. He basically took the Delian treasury and he moved it to Athens. And so what ended up happening was this led to the Delian League becoming like an empire over time. It was more like a trading empire, but the empire was composed of mostly members that were in the Delian League. And so Athens began taking all this money from this treasury. They began spending it on their own state, like expanding their navy. They began to put a lot of people on the payroll, like in the government, and they also began to put a lot of money into cultural things, like rebuilding the Acropolis, building the Parthenon, and supporting artists and things like that. And so that led to the so-called Golden Age of Athens, as they call it. And some people call it also the so-called Age of Pericles as well, because Pericles had a hand in all this for about 30 years in power. I think I've got images of Pericles, I think somewhere I do. Yeah, Pericles was not just a politician. He was also a general as well. He fought, I think, at the end of the Persian Wars throughout the Aegean. And so he kind of got a notoriety, being real popular. But he was also a man of the people as well. He was kind of like this populist figure that people looked up to overall. What are some famous things that he did Pericles? Well, the most famous thing he did was like I said, he rebuilt the Acropolis. You can see behind me, which included the famous Parthenon, which they think was completed close to about 432 BC. By the way, the Parthenon is very important. I think I talked about this before. I think I've had previous images I've shown it to you before. I think there's one here that I showed you previously, which was, I guess, the top left you see right there. But Acropolis is important because the fact that it's considered to be one of the key classical, architectural thing of the whole Greek world, classical age. And so its architecture was kind of instrumental in influencing other Greek city-states to kind of build similar architecture in general. And it is known for its surviving architecture, especially the so-called relief sculptures that are on it, which are kind of called different names. I think some people call it the Elgin marbles, and some people call it the Parthenon marbles as well, which were developed by the sculptor named Phidias, who was considered one of the greatest sculptors in the Greek world. He was a very close friend with Pericles. And Phidias was also the one, you may have heard about this, that that built the famous statue of Zeus, which was at Olympus, considered one of the seven wonders of the world at one point. And so, yeah, the Parthenon is important. But I tell you how the Elgin marbles are kind of controversial because half of them are in the British Museum in London, and the other half are in the Parthenon Museum in Athens. There was a guy named Earl of Elgin who took them. He did that because he thought that people would basically vandalize it, and that's why they did it. But as you know, the British don't want to give it back, and so that's kind of a controversy over that whole thing. But as you know, the Parthenon was later damaged. I think I talked about this before, but in September, this month, by the way, 1687, the Venetian fleet during the Great Turkish War bombed it. As you know, his cannonballs, whatever, blew it up. And so today, they're trying to rebuild it, as you know. But Pericles was instrumental. He promoted a lot of the arts and literature. That was something that was very unique that Athens did that maybe some other city-states didn't do as much. And so that's why Athens is so important as its influence towards, Greek culture and all that. That's part of why they had the first, I guess, modern Olympics at Athens, in 1896 and all that. And then, of course, fostered democracy is, of course, another thing that he did. I think under him, they started to give more rights even to like the lower classes and things like that had more power as well. Now, Pericles was in power to like maybe about 429 when he died, but they had this event that happened at the end of his time, which was called the Peloponnesian War, which broke out around 431, which was really not one war. It was a series of wars that took place over a period of like 2-3 decades. And it was a conflict, almost like a civil war between the Greek city-states, where it pitted these two alliances against each other, the so-called Delian League that we talked about, it was basically the so-called Athenian Empire. And then you had what they call the Peloponnesian League. The Peloponnesian League was kind of often called the so-called Spartan Confederation, led by the Spartans, who were very jealous of Athens because Athens was getting more and more powerful. They were kind of worried about that. They might take over all of Greece. And so they formed this alliance with other states, predominantly people that were mostly Dorian. And so Spartans, Corinth, Pylos, and later Thebes joined up with them. But they were called Peloponnesian League sometimes because most of the alliance was in the Peloponnese Peninsula. But Thebes and Boeotia, they joined also as well. And so on that side, you have the Delian League, which was Athens and all its various allies that were together. A lot of them were Ionian type city-states, and many of them were in the Aegean Basin. If you go look at this map I've got showing the location of it, you can see all these areas that are kind of like in yellow were areas that were allied with the Athenians, where it says Attica right there. So those are all the states that were there. And then you can see with this map here on the left, all those areas kind of like in a green area were areas that were kind of in support of Sparta during the war. And primarily why we know a lot about this war is because there was a general named Thucydides, who later was famous as a Greek historian, that wrote about the wars. I think it's now called the History of the Peloponnesian War. But his books became basically the primary source on the conflict itself. I think they called it Histories of Thucydides, that's what they originally called it. He said famously that Sparta felt threatened by Athens' growth of power, making the war inevitable. Of course, the word that he used. And so Thucydides, is considered pretty important. He's kind of like considered to be, they say, the so-called father of scientific history, because he starts to use more real sources, eyewitness accounts. He's different from Herodotus, who's more of a teller of tales, things like that. Because I told you, they called him the father of history, Herodotus, but some people thought he was the father of lies because he tended to exaggerate or maybe make up stuff sometimes. But Thucydides was more serious historian, using scientific sources and things like that. What happened in the war? The Spartan Confederation over time defeated Athens. Their naval power declined. It was actually crushed in the war. In fact, there was a famous expedition where the Athenians tried to attack Sicily, where Syracuse is. Syracuse was a city-state that was allied with the Spartans, and their fleet got destroyed. And then Persia came in too. And Persia, like in the east, supported also Sparta in the war with naval aid, and they were able to eventually defeat Athens. So by 404 BC, Athens was defeated. That kind of weakened basically a lot of the city-states after that, because you study about the Peloponnesian War. After that, it's kind of like, I think it's a toss-up. You get like, Sparta, I think in Thebes, it's also involved too. They kind of, for a while, you kind of think about that you've got. But Athens and Sparta, that great rival that we talked about before, it's there for a while, but it declines after that because Macedonia, which we'll get to later, Macedonia, which is up in northern Greece, they kind of come down and take over Greece. They take control of it and have a big sphere of influence, over the Greek world. That's because of the rise of kings like King Philip of Macedon, Philip II, and of course his son Alexander the Great. And so they're able to basically do that. But Athens is not as big of a power. They kind of weaken. I think for a while Sparta and Athens even kind of fight it out. I know in the early 4th century. But Macedonia is the one that's really going to come in and start taking control. All right, I'm going to move on next. And I'm going to, of course, talk about a little today about Greek culture. I'm going to get into that and talk about that. And, of course, one of the first things I'll talk about today, is the famous Olympics, that took place during Greece. And classical Age of Greece, it's known for a lot of different things, not just the Olympics. They're known for Greek plays, which a lot of Greek plays today, influenced like later, playwrights like Shakespeare, etc. Greek poetry influenced later the West, architecture, mythology, philosophy. We've already talked about history as well. And traditionally, games and things like that were something that the Greeks were kind of known for in ancient times. You can see images here I've got, of course, the Greek Olympics, which, like running, I think you see in the top left is probably the first kind of sport that they had overall. But there weren't just the ancient Olympics, the one that's the most famous one that they had. They had other ones that I kind of wanted to mention about. There's also at least 5 major pan-Hellenic games at one point that the Greeks put on in the Greek world. Of course, the Olympics, which is held at Olympia, is the one that's the most famous one overall. There's one called the Pythian Games that were held at Delphi, which is in Boeotia. That one was important. It honored the priestess Pythia, who was like an oracle that was famous, the Temple of Apollo there. Isthmian Games is also famous at Corinth, near the Isthmus of Corinth. The Nemean Games at Argos. And they also had the Panathenaic or Panathenaea Games they had too, which were held at Athens, which honored Pan and also Athena as well. So all of those were different games that were put on at one point. Of course, the most famous one they had, was the ancient Olympic ones that were held at Olympia. Olympia was a city-state that was in western Peloponnese, western part of Greece today, which originated, by the way, back in the 8th century BC. They think the traditional date of when the Olympics started was maybe around 776. And so of the 5, major pan-Hellenic games, this one was considered the oldest one that first started. And I guess all the others are kind of copying them is more or less what it was. They were held every 4 summers, which today it's still kind of a term that use measurement of time called an Olympiad. So every 4 summers, usually over like a week. And what happened was city-states usually would have a truce, like an Olympic truce that they would have where, neither side could kill each other. They could somebody was fighting a war, Sparta, Athens, whatever. They would just take a truce we'll kill you next year or whatever, or next time. And of course, they would have the games as a kind of a piece. And the games themselves were put on to honor, of course, the god Zeus. They had a very famous temple of Zeus there. That was Olympia. I told you that famous statue of Zeus made by the famous sculptor Phidias, of course, was there at one point. And so if you were an athlete, you had to actually go there and you would take an oath, in front of Zeus and all that. Women also participated in games. They had separate games that were called the Hurrian games, and women would basically participate in most like running type games and things like that, which were kind of put on at the same time. Only unmarried women could participate. In fact, I think married women couldn't even watch the games. They were forbidden, I think, by pain of death or something like that. But women did have their own kind of games, and kind of like today, a lot of Olympic sports are also segregated, pretty much like they are today. The most famous games they had initially, they had what they call a pentathlon. That's a famous series of sports. They had a 5-sport event. It is one of the most oldest events of the ancient Olympics that they had, which had 5 sports in it: discus throw, wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling, javelin throw, running, and of course the long jump as well. I do have images showing some of these events, of course, that they had. Here's some pictures, by the way, showing, of course, the 1896 Olympics, of course, were one of the first modern ones held, of course, in Athens. It's kind of a stadium they built, of course, for some of their events. But ancient Olympics, that's, of course, the famous stadium. Of course, at Olympia, I guess they had the Hippodrome there where they had, events that were put on. You could see here where a lot of the runners would start right here. So that's kind of like, of course, no more seating there anymore, but that was initially where the main stadium was. And this was the actual main entrance into the playing field right there. Of course, those are images of the long jump, which was, of course, in the part of the pentathlon. The long jump, they would usually propel themselves with using some kind of weights in their hands. They did have other events, too, that were popular. The chariot race was a very popular race. If you know about in the Greek world, horse racing, chariot racing was very popular. A lot of people like to bet on it. And of course, it was also very violent or bloody sometimes because people would get killed, that kind of thing. So, like in the Greek world, they had later the Hippodrome, Constantinople. The Roman world, they had, of course, the Circus Maximus as examples. Here's examples of runners, of course, on the left. They did have a sport called pancration. Pancration was a type of sport that's kind of similar to what we call mixed martial arts. It's kind of like a version between wrestling and boxing. And of course, it's kind of influenced the MMA today, that kind of, type of sport that's popular now that you see on TV. But it had very little rules. You could practically almost bite the other guy's ear off. And a lot of these blood sports like that, boxing, wrestling, were sometimes to the death, believe it or not. So wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling was another one. Boxing, I mentioned too, was another sport. They had the discus throw, which they think some of these may have come from the idea of warfare. The javelin throw also as well. Also, they had this other event that was kind of comical that was called the hoplitodromus. This was so-called hoplite race, which they think was developed in the 6th century BC. It's a type of race, kind of like just running, where basically hoplites, like soldiers, would run with their armor on. And so you can imagine this was kind of a comical thing to see, but it was an event that was kind of probably popular as well, of course, in the Greek world. Now, what did you get when you won? That's, of course, another thing I kind of need to talk about as well. Well, I guess it varied on that one, but a lot of times you would get they put like this wreath on your head, basically that would basically kind of like a medal or whatever. I think there were cases where they'd give you like a jug of olive oil or something like that also as a victory. But the main thing you got when you won, if you know about it, you got the bragging rights. So for the next 4 years, you won an event. You were considered a hero to a lot of Greeks, and people practically would give you like free dinners and things like that. And so the Greeks a long time ago, like today, they were big fans. I think they said 5% of the population would actually try to go watch the Olympics. And so athletes were big heroes. You'd even see like graffiti written on walls where they would say Ajax, is a great, athlete. And then somebody would come behind and cross it out and say, no, he's not, things like that. And so they were big into, athletics in general overall. But actually, for a while, the Romans brought it back. I think for a while it kind of faded. And then under the Roman Empire, Emperor Augustus brought it back around the 1st century, 2,000 years ago. And so the Olympics kind of became this Mediterranean regional kind of games that were put on. They were still popular. There was even a case where some of the Roman emperors participated. There was a case in 67 CE where Emperor Nero did participate in the chariot race, which is true about that. And it's very famous. He fell off his chariot in the middle of the race. But they basically gave him first place because they thought he would win. Probably because he was the emperor, also as well. But over time, though, in the next 3-4 centuries, though, the Romans decided that they were becoming Christians, and it was all kind of considered like a pagan, festival that's kind of going on, which it also was. And so there was an emperor named Theodosius the First, or also called the Great, that banned it. I think maybe 396 AD or CE, he banned it. And so that was all done because of the fact that the Romans had become Christian, and so they didn't want to do all this pagan rituals and things like that that were kind of going on still in Greece. And so that's why it was eventually banned. It wasn't until like almost, you get down to like basically 1,500 years later, when 1,500 years later, when basically modern Europe brought back the games, like the idea of the Olympic Games. And so this was done in April of 1896 with the so-called first Olympic Games, Summer Games, really held at Athens, Greece. And so 14 nations, by the way, participated. France and England, countries like that, they think were kind of instrumental in developing the Olympic Games. And then after that, they began to have Summer Games first, and then by the early 20th century, they started having Winter Games that they also added later as well. The modern games are like modern Olympics are not the same, as the ancient ones. I mean, I think these are more professionalized. Back then, it was just like mostly amateur type sports, which for a long time, the early modern Olympics were, but recently, a few decades ago, they went to professional sports, mostly, as you know. And they are controversial, the new games, because the fact that there's been a lot of problems of doping and bribing and other problems like that they've had with the games. And it's kind of real commercialized now, as you know. Right, I'm going to move on. Of course, I'm going to talk about a few other things, of course, with the Greeks that are famous for. The Greeks are also known for things like drama play as well, which is so-called Greek tragedy is the thing that they're kind of well known that influenced other playwrights, later like Shakespeare and all that. And, the tragedy is something that they're known for because, it's about these famous heroes or characters that have a famous downfall where something bad happens to them or they die as well, often kind of what happened. And the Greeks would often put plays on like at festivals, like the Dionysia is one of the big festivals that they would have in Greece. Sometimes at some of these games, they would put on plays also as well. And the three greatest surviving tragedians is really these three. There's only three that survive, which are Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides that you have. Of course, I got some examples right there, some of those plays right there. But here's, of course, some of the famous plays and their playwrights and their plays that they're kind of known for overall. So you got there at the top left, Aeschylus. Aeschylus is a very famous playwright. He's known for writing some of the first tragic plays. He's considered the so-called father of the tragedy. He's very famous for also inventing this so-called trilogy, a three-part play or three-part story. And Aristea, or the Aristea, is considered one of the first trilogies, the only one that survived from Greek times. And it's about the backdrop of Agamemnon, in the post-Trojan War era and all that. And so it talks about the tragedy of the so-called House of Atreus and all that. Sophocles, who you see there, wrote, of course, Oedipus Rex. They considered him to be really the greatest playwright, of ancient Greece. His plays won a lot of awards at festivals and things like that. Oedipus Rex is important because it's considered to be the great classical play, of the Greek world. And of course, the tragic play about this character named Oedipus, the king, as you know, where there's this omen that he's going to kill his father and marry his mother, which he does. So a lot of these plays, have a lot of irony, of course, in them. Euripides was another famous playwright. Most of these lived in the 5th century. Euripides was very popular, by the way, mostly because of the fact that he had so many plays that survived. Looks like Aeschylus had 7 plays that survived. Sophocles had 7 plays that survived. Sophocles wrote, I think at one point, 120 plays, but for some reason, only 7 survived. Euripides had 18 that survived, including Medea, which is considered one of his greatest plays that he did. And Medea is about this woman that's married to, you may have heard of Jason the Argonauts. Jason, he was a famous hero, Greek stories. And anyway, Jason wanted to remarry a younger woman. And so Medea basically got mad and killed basically his wife and his new wife and their children, and her children also as well. Medea's got kind of a story about divorce, which, divorce was something that was real rampant, in the Greek world in general. And so that's kind of an interesting tragic type play that's kind of very popular still today. Also, they had another playwright who was more of a comic. Of course, Aristophanes, you may have heard of him. He wrote comedies and satires like Lysistrata, that's well known. And a lot of his plays made fun of people, made fun of culture, talked about maybe historical events that were kind of going on at the time. Lysistrata is actually an anti-war play. In fact, considered one of the first ones made like this. And it's on the backdrop of the whole Peloponnesian War, where the women of, I think, Athens want to basically end warfare. They're tired of their men going off to war. And this woman named Lysistrata comes up with this idea to have a sex strike to try to end the war. And so that's what the whole plot of the play is about. It's also got another play called The Clouds that's kind of popular as well, which is an interesting play because it actually got, it kind of makes fun of people like Socrates and got him in hot water. They say it led to his death, Socrates. So it's an interesting story about that. But he's got all kinds of plays that are famous, that are, of course, well known. And so today, a lot of these plays have had influence on modern plays. Like Shakespeare, I know, was probably definitely influenced to write some, tragic type plays later. Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, and, so on. All right, let me move on. Let me also talk about as well philosophy as well. That's something, the Greeks are very famous for overall. They always talk about the big 3. Sometimes a nickname they talk about, which is the so-called Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, which those were considered to be really Greece's biggest philosophers that really had the most influence, with Socrates being one of the first that you always hear about. But they don't think Socrates started philosophy as far as they know. They believe that Thales of Miletus, who was also a mathematician, was a philosopher that they think helped to kind of start Western philosophy, maybe close to about the 7th or the 6th centuries when Thales, lived about. And so they consider him to be the father of Western philosophy. And the word philosophy, by the way, is a Greek word from the word philosophos, which means in Greek, love of wisdom or love of knowledge. And so in ancient times, like in Greece, anything you're talking about could be philosophy. Whether you're talking about history, you're talking about, math, whatever it is, early science. Those are all forms of philosophy. You're a poet. You're also a philosopher as well, and things like that. But yeah, Socrates, was considered to be one of the first great philosophers. They kind of consider him to be one of the founding fathers, of Greek philosophy overall. He was this prototypical philosopher that influenced like Plato, and I guess Plato, influenced Aristotle on down the line. And Socrates had some kind of philosophical school that he had at Athens, and he was known for teaching in a form of pedagogy that was called the dialectic method, sometimes called the Socratic method, where he kind of used a questioning and discussion type sessions to, I guess, get more information from his students, draw individual answers out of them, and it helped to encourage further insight into the issue that they were discussing. And he was known for various maxims that he said a long time ago, such as the unexamined life is not worth living. I think he said know thyself or know yourself, things like that. What was the other thing he said? I know you won't believe me, but the highest form of human excellence is to question oneself and others. That was the famous quote he said. And he did die by that. This idea, I think when he was, about on trial in 399 BC, he was put on trial for, I think, corrupting the youth of Athens and a few other things. And he believed basically that if he couldn't teach what he wanted to do, he'd rather just kill himself. And of course, there's been a lot of paintings made, the death of Socrates, which is, very famous. That's the most famous in the 18th century by Jacques-Louis David, depicts, Socrates before he takes the hemlock poison, and he could have chosen exile. That's the thing about Socrates. Like I said, he lived by the maxim and he died by it, as you know. Plato, of course, was one of his best students, of course, who came along. And of course, Plato is very famous for, kind of considered to be one of the greatest, Greek philosophers. He's known for his, Platonic philosophy, which, influenced a lot of philosophy later, even influenced, they say, Christianity, they think, Christian thought. He also had his own school, which was called the Academy, which was considered one of the first major schools of higher learning in the Greek world. It was named after a Greek hero named Academus. And it's kind of where we get the word academics, academia, those kind of terms, that are kind of used today are derived from this particular school. This school was around for at least 300 years, down to Roman times, and had a major influence on a lot of Greek Roman thought later. He is known for a lot of works. One thing about Plato that's different from him compared to Socrates, Plato did write a lot of his works down. He even wrote down a lot of the dialogues of Socrates. Him and I think Xenophon was the other one that did that. And he had several books like the Apology of Socrates is very famous, but his most famous work was really the Republic, which was more of a political treatise about the idea of the perfect society, perfect political ideologies. And I think they say that particular philosophical work is really his most influential overall. And it's kind of ironic about the name Republic. I mean, you think Republic, he likes a Republican type state. Actually, no. Plato thought that the best form of government was an educated king. I think he called it a philosopher king or something like that. Kind of like a Alexander the Great, maybe, or something like that. But that was his view, of basically what a king should be. Of course, they always show images like of the so-called School of Athens, which is a very famous painting done by Raphael during the Renaissance, I guess depicting all these famous minds, that were basically in Athens. Small town, but you had all these smart people that they had. And you see in the middle there, you can see that you got Plato and Aristotle that are right there. That's who I want to talk about too. He was also well known, which is Aristotle. Aristotle, they think, was considered a really great philosopher as well. Of course, Macedonia. He was a real big pupil, of course, of Plato, considered one of his best overall. He had a rival school to Plato's. At first, he went to Plato's, academy. He taught there briefly, and then after that, he created his own school later in what they call the Lyceum Temple. But it wasn't really called that. It was actually called the Peripatetic School, which meant like the walk-around school, because Aristotle liked to walk around, like from different parts of the temple, and teach his students, kind of like professors going from classroom to classroom, I guess, that kind of deal. And so Aristotle was a kind of a polymath. He knew just about any kind of subject. He wasn't just a philosopher or mathematician or whatever. He knew a lot of different things, sciences and things, scientific fields and so on. He's very famous for tutoring Alexander the Great. One thing about Aristotle was at one point he went back to Macedonia, created a school there where he educated a lot of the Macedonian nobility, and he had a major influence on Alexander the Great. Even, I think, gave Alexander a personalized copy of the Iliad, which I think Alexander, that was like one of his favorite books. And so they do think that Aristotle had a major influence on Alexander, and maybe why he ended up being this genius that would militarily conquer the Near East later on. He was also known for publishing a lot of works, but a lot of these works were actually his lecture notes, that he wrote from different subjects, physics, metaphysics, whatever. But they say his most famous philosophical work is Nicomachean Ethics, which I read years ago. But he was a jack of all trades. I mean, he basically studied anything from biology. In fact, the natural sciences is one of the areas that he really was very interested. In fact, his Lyceum was kind of specialized in a lot of the scientific fields, like your natural sciences, like biology and botany and things like that today, zoology. And I think when Alexander was conquering the East, he actually had Alexander send him specimens of animals and plants that were kind of unique. But he studied physics, logic, metaphysics, ethics, poetry, plays, music, rhetoric, politics, government, astronomy. So the man was a polymath. He pretty much, I still think he was probably one of the greatest philosophers, because of his just genius. And he does influence a lot of medieval thought, like this school does, because it's around for a while also as well. Because I think the Lyceum's around till Roman times, both those schools with the academy. So kind of just talking about some of these different, philosophers that are kind of well known. There's other philosophers as well, that we really didn't talk about that are famous. I've kind of had a list of them here that were there, but Pythagoras, Diogenes, Democritus, Heraclitus, Epicurus, who developed Epicureanism, Zeno developed Stoicism, Xenophon. Those are all other famous, philosophers that you may have heard of, at one point in the Greek world. They later, of course, influenced, the Romans pretty much. All right, so I'm also going to move on. I got one more thing, of course, to talk about today. I did want to get into and talk about, of course, Greek mythology, Greek gods and all that, because that's something that's also part of, religion of the Greek Roman world, because the Romans kind of adopt a lot of these gods also as well here. You can see there that Greek pantheon was extensive. They had, of course, a bunch of gods that they often referred to as being called the so-called Olympians that they have. These are like the chief gods that are kind of considered the ones that were the most important, in the Greek world. They had other gods too. The Greeks had hundreds of gods, that they worship, but there were chief gods that were more instrumental, that were important. These are the ones that were basically the ones that lived on Mount Olympus. At least the Greeks believed this in mythology, that they resided there in northern Greece at one point. I think the Romans pretty much don't really believe that, as much, that kind of mythology stuff. But they were often called, the 12 Olympians were often called Dodecatheon, which meant in Greek 12 gods. And so the ones that are mostly in yellow that you see there, Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Hestia, Demeter, Athena, Apollo, Aphrodite, Hermes, Artemis, Ares, Festus, or Vulcan. Those are the ones that are often kind of considered to be the so-called 12 Olympians. Now, Hades, it's kind of a controversy over that. Some people think Hades was one of the 12 Olympians, which maybe usually is. But the problem with Hades is that he didn't reside, about that on Mount Olympus. He resided, of course, in the underworld. In Greek mythology, if you look at the earth was not inhabited by them first. They had these huge gods that were called the Titans that supposedly controlled the earth. And the two got in a war called the Titanmachy, or the War of the Titans, as you know, which is a 10-year war where they fought for control of earth. And what happened afterwards was that the Olympians took over in mythology and controlled the earth. And what happened was, after defeating the Titans, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, who were, by the way, sons of Kronos, one of the Titans, basically divided up the world, between them that you're looking at. So you look at the three on the left there, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. They all divided up the world. Zeus got the sky or the heavens. Poseidon got the oceans, the seas. Then Hades got the underworld. So that's how they basically divided up things between them. So kind of, if you want that there, put it on the screen for you. But and then they had these sisters they had too, the sisters of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, Hera, Hestia, Demeter. Those are all children of Kronos, also one of the Titans as well. And then you got the children of Zeus that you got, which were born from different females, but Athena, Apollo, Aphrodite, Hermes, Artemis, Ares, Hephaestus, those are the main ones. There's other ones too that are also children or demigods, Hercules or something like that, or Perseus also too, or something like that. They're basically also considered children of Zeus as well. Now I'm going to kind of go through each one of these, of the Olympians, of course, we'll talk about, of course, today. Now, Zeus, you see here, was considered to be, the most famous of the Greek gods. Of course, the Romans called him later Jupiter. They called him or Jove. And he was often known as the Thunder Maker because his main weapon, of course, is a thunderbolt. And he's considered the supreme god of the Greeks, and of course later the Romans, and successor to Kronos, and god of the sky, god of lightning, god of thunder. Also people saw him as the Lord Justice, things like that, ruling from, of course, Mount Olympus. Then you got Hera, of course. They also call Juno, which June's named after in the month today, like most of the calendar. She, of course, is the husband. She's with husband Zeus, but that's basically her husband. She's the wife of Zeus. She's also his sister as well, and of course, considered one of the most powerful goddesses in the Greek world. Her and Zeus often don't get along, often because Zeus was known for philandering and things like that. But she is associated with things like marriage, childbirth, and things that deal with women. So she's kind of like this mother goddess associated, of course, with the Greeks. They also have Poseidon, of course, we talked about before. Of course, I told you, a brother of Zeus, of course, famous for his trident weapon, looks like a pitchfork. And of course, the Romans called him later Neptune. As you know, he, of course, controlled the oceans, the seas. He's the god that creates like earthquakes, tsunami, tidal waves. And it's actually known for having a palace below the ocean. So he kind of goes back and forth between Mount Olympus in the ocean. After Zeus, Poseidon is probably the second most powerful of the Greek gods originally. Hades, of course, known as Pluto, which Pluto was really the real name that he went by. He's sometimes also called Dis as well. But Hades was considered the god of the underworld. He was also the god of wealth as well. He had a weapon too, which was called the Helm of Darkness. Was what it's called, or Helmet of Darkness. It's called different names. And it was a type of helmet where if you put it on your head, it made you invisible. I think also about the cap or cape. I think cap of invisibility, I think was the other name that they also called it as well. So basically, he ruled over Hades. He controlled the underworld, but he was really called Pluto. Hestia, of course, another sister. Of course, we're talking about goddess of the hearth. She was important because she represented like the eternal flame, like the home in general of women in the Greek-Roman world. The Romans called her Vesta also as well. And I know in the Roman world, she was real popular. They had these so-called Vestal virgins that would tend the fire, this eternal flame that they would keep. That represented like the state and the home and things like that. They also had Demeter, who was known as Ceres, also to the Romans. She was the goddess of harvest, grain, agriculture. She's a kind of another sister to Hades and Poseidon and Zeus. And she had a famous daughter named Persephone that was married to Hades. You may have heard this mythology story. And supposedly, when she would go back and forth between where Demeter is and where Hades is in the underworld, it would cause the changing of the seasons. And so when she was with Demeter, they would have springtime. And then when she would go live with Hades, winter would happen, things like that. Those are kind of mythological stories of why the seasons change and things like that, at least what they believed anyway, back then. Athena is, of course, another famous goddess. Of course, we've talked about before, patron goddess of Athens, of course, known by Minerva to the Romans. She, of course, is very important because you're seen as this goddess of wisdom, art, culture, but she's also a goddess of war as well. In Greek mythology, there's a story where Zeus had a horrible headache one day, and so they hammered his head out until she popped out, basically. And Athena is one of three virgin goddesses the Greeks were known for. Apollo, of course, very famous god, of course, to the Greeks. He doesn't really have another name. The Romans called him Apollo also as well. It's mostly a god of the sun, light, but you can see other things he's associated with, like poetry. Like you can see he's got this lyre. I guess people would sing poetry. The god of knowledge, truth, but also prophecy. He's often associated with prophecy. In a lot of temples, like the temple at Delphi, there was an oracle there named Pythia that would tell your prophecy. And usually it'd be in the form of a riddle. And so Apollo was real popular. There was a temple like on Delos. They think he was born. He was also known for carrying a golden bow and arrow as well. Dionysus is another famous god. They don't consider him sometimes to be an Olympian, but they do think he was maybe at one point, they do think he's like a son of Zeus. And it's mostly a god of wine, also associated with fertility. Of course, Dionysus was very popular with Bacchus, with the Romans, like a similar type god. And oftentimes they had these festivals that were called the Dionysia or Great Dionysius that was put on, where they put on plays and things like that. And a lot of these cults, like especially in the Roman world, I know, they had a lot of cults where they would have like these orgies, which were called like Bacchae parties that they would have. But he was a very popular god. And, like in New Orleans, they got a parade like Crew of Bacchus and things like that. You've probably heard of all that. Aphrodite, of course, another famous goddess, of course, known by the name Venus, the Romans equivalent. And, of course, she is considered, of course, the goddess of beauty and love. They do think she was considered to be the most beautiful of the Greek goddesses. That's her with her son Eros, who the Romans called Cupid, the god of erotic love. Both those are kind of associated with love But Aphrodite's kind of envisioned as this perfect goddess, beautiful. They've done a lot of statues of her, like Venus de Milo, that you may have heard of, like in Italy. There's a lot of stories in mythology about her where she's has this love affair with Mars that you heard of. Hermes, of course, known as Mercury, of course, was deemed as Zeus's messenger god that would go around. He kind of like be like the eyes and ears of Zeus, and he was often associated with a lot of things: commerce, like dealing with business, things like that, money, fortune, and luck were things that were often associated with Hermes. A lot of athletes would worship Hermes, like the Olympics or whatever, because they thought that that would make them fast and things like that. Hermes is famous for having wings on his helmet and wings on his feet. Thieves would also worship him too, because they thought it would make them quick in stealing things as well. You got to be, I guess, fast on your feet. So yeah, that's Hermes, or of course Mercury. You can see a lot of the Roman names are also named for some of our planets as well in the solar system. Artemis, of course, the Romans called Diana, a very famous goddess as well, daughter of Zeus. She's mostly known as the Virgin Huntress, very famous for being associated with hunting and the wild. She's a moon goddess. She's also deemed as a protector of children, dealing with birth. And so she's, like I said, one of three goddesses that are considered to be a virgin. Now you also have Ares as well, who of course known as Mars. Ares, of course, was not that popular with the Greeks. I think if you study about Mars, the Roman equivalent, that was a god that was more familiar with the Romans. They kind of like warfare, the Romans, and looked up to that god. And even thought some of their kings, like Romulus, were descended from Mars. But I think the Greeks were not as big into Ares like they were. But god of war, god of violence, things like that. He was, deemed in a mythology to be, of course, supposedly the lover of Aphrodite. That was their son, Eros or Cupid. That's kind of famous as well. Most images of Ares or Mars are usually in the image of a soldier, like a hoplite, or maybe like a legionnaire type Roman soldier, like you see probably on the right, maybe. But anyway, it had one more I wanted to add too that was also an Olympian, which was Hephaestus, that they later called Vulcan, the Romans. And this particular god was seen as the god of fire, blacksmiths. He was the one that was kind of seen as the blacksmith of the gods and would often forge a lot of weapons for the gods. And so, gods like, Zeus, his thunderbolt, or the trident of Poseidon, or the helm of darkness, for Hades. I think some of the weapons, used by, or armor used by Perseus, or maybe the shield of Achilles. I think these are the kind of things that are often associated with, of course, Vulcan and all that. So those are some of the various gods that, the Greeks, believed in and all that. But Romans kind of didn't quite have such a seriousness into all these gods. I think over time they even let in other foreign gods, as you know, into the Roman world. And over time, the Romans got rid of, the old Greek gods and other gods, and they went more to, of course, Christianity. So anyway, kind of talking about classical Greek culture and, things that the Greek city-states were kind of known for in ancient times. But anyway, this is, of course, going to include my lecture, of course, on this, part 3 lecture. I am going to be adding, by the way, a 4th lecture on the Greeks. I know it's a lot, but I do have to cover, the period of Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic Age. So there will be a 4th lecture I'll add, which is from the summer classes on him, which I'll have a few questions on Alexander, on the test that I'll have as well to be included with that second exam. But I am posting a second exam, of course, today. So make sure, you start working on that by next week. You have other assignments out. I think the first exam is still out. I know it's still, I think, probably due tonight or due this weekend, I know. And then you have also the India quiz also to work on as well. So if you have any comments, questions, of course, about this lecture or any other lecture, please let me know, of course, in either YouTube, or you can email me also as well. I think everybody's got my email address pretty much. So y'all have a great weekend, of course, coming up. And of course, like I said, next week, I'm going to kind of move on to probably the last thing I'll probably lecture on, I know, for the semester, for the 7 weeks class, which will be, of course, on the Romans overall. So y'all take care and have a great weekend, of course, coming up. So y'all take care.